Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple more seconds just to to make sure that everybody joins, and we will shortly be starting. Okay. Okay, I think we'll get started then. So, good morning, everyone, and a very big welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. With more than 1,000 registrations, this has certainly become Phoenix's most popular webinar to date. And I think that's because every organisation wants to know the answer to one very important question. And that is, if the worst happened tomorrow, would we be ready? Not just to respond operationally, but to respond legally and to ensure the decisions we make stand up to scrutiny whilst also protecting our people and, of course, our organisation. And that's exactly what today's session is all about. We'll be exploring what determines legal exposure following a serious incident, why those first decisions matter so much, and how organisations can put themselves in the strongest possible position long before they're ever tested. So, whether you're a senior leader, a health and safety professional, or an operational manager, our aim is that you'll leave today's session with practical insights that you can take back into your own organisation straight away. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First, we have Toby Bidwell, Director here at Phoenix Health and Safety. Toby spends his time helping organisations prepare for exactly the kinds of situations that we'll be discussing in today's session. He works with organisations right across the UK to strengthen governance, to improve decision making, and to build practical safety systems that don't just achieve compliance, but stand up to operational and regulatory scrutiny. And joining Toby is Rhian Greaves, partner in the Safety, Health and Environment team at DAC Beachcroft. And Rhian sees the other side of the picture. She represents businesses and individuals facing health and safety enforcement action, giving her first-hand insight into how investigations unfold and what ultimately determines legal exposure. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Toby to begin. Thanks, Toby.
Thank you, Karina. And yet, first and foremost, thank you to everybody that's taken the time to join this webinar today. And it's a pleasure to have Rhian on board for this session as well. So hopefully a lot of key takeaways for you following this. So the overview, starting with context. So everything that needs to be considered from a health and safety and environmental perspective when it comes to the law. We're going to look at what happens when the regulators come. So unpicking the importance of perception and the vast range of enforcement tools. We're going to look at strong investigation management, what that looks like. So how to ensure smooth and seamless investigative processes. And then preparation being key. So how effective planning and preparation can impact success. Now, what we particularly want us to explore today is what happens between the incident occurring and the formal investigation developing. So that early period is where operational decisions, communications, and evidence can become extremely important. So as Rhian takes us through this session, just consider whether your own organization has genuinely prepared for this scenario and the scenarios that we discuss, rather than simply having an incident procedure on file. Now, we're going to kick off with a poll. We do like a poll at Phoenix. So we would like you to answer the following question. So in relation to serious incidents and investigations, which role best describes your level of responsibility? So is it A, are you a senior leader or director with ultimate accountability for health and safety operations, risk or governance? Is it B, do you lead a function or region? It could be HR, operations, etc., and influence how investigations are handled. Are you a manager or a practitioner involved in investigations and incident responses? Or D, you're here to learn and advise, but not directly responsible for incident responses. And it's this part of the webinar where I sound a bit like Chris Tarrant from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Now we're going to come across to Hannah, who is going to open up the polls and confirm the results in just a moment. And I think the key is, so whatever your role, just think about where you would sit in the response if a serious incident happened tomorrow. So would you know who takes control, who contacts whom, and where your own authority begins and then ends. So over to you, Hannah, to keep us updated.
Yeah, we've had about 75% participation, so thank you, everybody. If I just end the poll now, we're looking at 39% for option B,
Yeah.
leading a function or region, and 32% for a manager or practitioner. Those are the top two.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everybody that voted, and thank you, Hannah. It really helps us to shape the rest of this webinar just to maximise the quality of the takeaways that you have. Now, I'm going to come across to Rhian to kick off some of the key parts of this show. So over to you, Rhian.
Thank you, Toby, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to Phoenix for hosting me this morning. As Toby said, I'm really here to give you an understanding for those of you who haven't ever, thankfully, had to go through the process of dealing with a serious incident, just to give you some of the context around what we will be talking about later on in the webinar in terms of the importance of being prepared. And I always like to show this slide at the start of any incident management type session that I'm speaking at, because to me it really encapsulates what it feels like and how much there is to manage when a serious incident happens. I think from a health and safety professional's perspective, clearly you will be thinking very much about what has happened and the people involved, and also starting to tick over in your own minds what might have gone wrong and what can we do to put things right, what remedial steps might we take. But the reality is that for the organisation, and of course you will form a fundamental part of the organisational response, for the organisation there is so much that is happening when there is a serious incident. Now, the first thing to say is that when there is a health and safety incident, the place where the accident has happened becomes a crime scene. It is often shocking to clients when I turn up at following an incident, and I have to tell them that a breach of health and safety law is a crime. So it is a crime scene. So you may well have a crime scene that you've got to look after on your premises, which in and of itself is clearly not an everyday occurrence. So securing the crime scene, thinking about securing the evidence for the regulator as well as for yourselves as an organisation is incredibly important. And if you get that wrong, as well-meaning as it can be, we have increasingly started to see that allied with health and safety investigations are also investigations into things like conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, which most law-abiding businesses absolutely would not come across on a regular basis. So securing the crime scene is important. And in some cases, that might also mean that you have to do something or take some steps in order to remove a risk. So if whatever the risk is that's caused the accident is ongoing, you have to immediately be able to think about managing that. How are we going to deal with that? There are, of course, a lot of people impacts that come with an incident. The very worst cases that I deal with, of course, sadly, we continue to have fatal accidents in the workplace. And they are, they're all etched in my memory. All of the ones I've been to over 20 years of dealing with this in these kinds of cases, because there is a very specific way that a workplace feels after something like that. But even where there hasn't been a fatality, any sort of incident where somebody is going home from work, via the hospital or not in the condition that they arrived, is really distressing for everybody involved. It's particularly distressing, I always think, for the health and safety professional, because you're all conscientious people and you very much take it almost personally, what has happened, but also for everybody around. So there are a huge amount of HR impacts, for example, that need to be managed. You need to think about how you're dealing with not only people who've been injured, but also people who've seen what's happened, who may be distressed about what's happened. And there are a huge number of then concerns that come later, things like mental health and well-being concerns. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to preparedness later on this morning. Aside from the people issues, then of course you've got a business to run. It might be that the regulator has come along and has left a notice to leave undisturbed, for example. So where the accident has happened, for example, in a manufacturing operation, the HSE might come along and say, you can't use that line at all until we've got the evidence we want and we say otherwise, we're happy it's safe. How are you going to carry on your business? So, clearly then your operational colleagues are involved in thinking about how you're able to satisfy your customer demands, how are you able to keep going, keep people in employment, so on and so forth, whilst all of this incident is unfolding before you. You've clearly then got to start to think about understanding yourselves what has gone wrong. So the internal investigation, which depending on what's happened, can be very wide ranging and can take up a huge amount of management time. And then when we look over to the column on the right hand side of this slide, you can start to see some of the more perhaps the issues that you're not immediately thinking about, but once the regulators get going, they start to demand documents from you, coming to see witnesses to take statements. They're occupying meeting room space. They want to look at bits of equipment. They want to get their experts to come in and carry out their own investigations. There's enforcement action potentially to follow. That's one part of the legal process, and that's what I deal with. That's my specialism. But then there are other potential legal processes that might flow from it. So, for example, employment tribunals, personal injury claims, your worst case scenario where there's been a fatal accident, there may be a coroner's inquest process, there may be property damage claims. There's all sorts of other legal issues that can arise from an incident. Many of you on the call will be well known. You'll be well-known brands. You'll have to protect that brand whilst all this is happening. And you can probably all think about health and safety incidents that have hit the press over the years where brand has not been particularly well protected. But thinking about how you're going to do that is really, really important, particularly in the social media age that we live in today. And then, there are the financial and commercial implications as well. Increased insurance premiums, claims on your insurance policies, the impact of having to disclose the fact of an incident, and maybe enforcement action that follows in things like tendering applications. Equally, when it comes to things like talent attraction, we know very much that the younger generations coming into the workforce, they're interested in things like this in a way perhaps that the older generations may not have asked those questions. So there is a huge amount that goes into the investigation and what follows an incident. And it might seem that there is a lot on that slide, and there is, but virtually every case I have has the majority of these factors happening within them alongside the fact of the incident itself. So it's really, really important to do what you can to be prepared for the incident so that you can hopefully best manage the organisation through it. Now, we've talked a lot about the people aspect, and we've talked about the commercial aspect and the legal aspect, but just to touch finally on those final 2 points on the slide there, these are the ones that really bring it home for me, is the moral consequences. Even in very large businesses, people feel for people. And when there are people been injured at work, the moral consequences of that, I find a lot of clients really struggle to deal with, understandably so. And then also the impact of having a criminal record should the regulator decide to prosecute. And again, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail shortly.
It's just such a thought-provoking list there, Rhian. And I think what strikes me the most about this list is that, when there is a serious incident, it stops becoming a purely health and safety issue almost immediately. You mentioned operations, HR involvement, insurers, senior leaderships. And I think if you've not been exposed to a serious or significant incident, you may not have been aware of this. So it's really insightful. And I guess for me, I'm a bit curious, really, Rhian, when you arrive to support an organisation after a serious incident, where would you say you typically see the greatest risk of those different functions inadvertently making the situation worse? Because I'm sure that must happen from time to time.
It happens more than from time to time, Toby. I'll be honest. And
Fair
that's why preparedness is so important. And that's why sessions like today are so important, just in terms of spreading that word. I mean, where I see I see two things. I see one is that there is there's panic. And there's therefore no real control over what is happening, both from the perspective of dealing with the legal process, but also in drawing all of these threads together. So that's why it's so important to have a plan and to really think about who would you want to be involved. And that's why this list is really helpful, I think, actually, because it starts the cogs whirring in terms of, okay, within our organisation, right, we will need someone from HR. Yeah, we might need someone from our comms team if we have one, for example. Do we have an in-house lawyer? They would need to know. So it's making sure that you've drawn those threads together in advance is really, really helpful. And then the other thing that I would say that I see, and this is absolutely not meant to be critical of health and safety professionals at all, but the reason that health and safety professionals do the job that you do is because you want to stop people being injured and made ill by their work, which is just phenomenal, and it inspires me every day. However, you have to be really careful about how you go about that in the aftermath of an incident, because it is really important clearly to understand quickly and thoroughly what has gone wrong, and if something has gone wrong and if you need to change something, but also from an organisational perspective, you've got to do that in the right way so that you are not unduly harming the organisation at the same time.
Yeah, such a valid point. Cheers, Rhian.
So turning now to one of the issues that I will typically deal with, and that's what happens when the regulator comes along. So for many of you on the call, you may well be regulated by the HSE for health and safety purposes. Obviously, some of you will work in industries where the local authority is the key health and safety regulator. But regardless, they will do things according to the same principles, not in the same way, I have to say, but according to the same principles. And what they are doing is they're coming to carry out a criminal investigation. So it's really important in the aftermath of an incident that everybody who needs to know that is aware of that. And also that, thinking about perception from the word go. So when you have an incident and the HSE or the regulator is coming to investigate, making sure that from every interaction they have with whoever it is on your site, they come away with the feeling that, yes, it's important what they're doing. Yes, you are cooperating with what they're doing. And yes, this is a responsible organisation. Those sound like basic things, but you'd be amazed how many times that doesn't happen. So, perception is really, really important, because one of the ways that the HSE make their decisions is according to their enforcement management model. And one of the things that they are asked to consider is, how has the duty holder responded to this incident? And do they have confidence that the duty holder has understood what's happened, has taken responsibility if that's necessary, and can manage their risk going forwards? And so making sure that comes across is really, really important. Now, it's also key that everybody who needs to understand does understand that it's a criminal investigation. And that means that nothing's off the record. If I had £1 for every client who told me how nice the HSE inspector was and how, they just had a lovely chat and, talked through all the issues and shown them all the documents and whatever it might be, I wouldn't need to be working today. The HSE, lots of the inspectors are nice people. That shouldn't be a surprise. They're not going to come in aggressively, particularly. But the reality is they are there to investigate whether any person or company has committed a criminal offence. And so you just need to be aware of those parameters when you're dealing with them, and the fact that nothing is off the record. They have a very wide range of enforcement tools, which run right from a warning letter, which will remain on your file for reference in the event of a future incident, right through notifications of contravention, triggering the fees for intervention, of course, improvement and prohibition notices, right through to criminal prosecutions. And where you have a prosecution, clearly that can result in a criminal conviction. Now, for an organisation, we touched on the last slide on some of the impacts that will have on an organisation, and I'm sure that most people on the call today will be well aware of how significant the financial penalties can be for organisations that are in breach of health and safety legislation. But also important to just consider as individuals, because that still does happen, that we still do see some individual investigations and prosecutions. Health and safety offences, worst case scenario where you've had a fatality, you might have individuals charged with gross negligence manslaughter. You may be looking at custodial sentences in the exceptional cases. I don't want anyone to go away from here today thinking that they're going to prison. It is the exceptional cases, but that is there, that facility is there. But even if we are talking about an individual perhaps who is fined as a result of a health and safety incident, that can have a huge impact. It's still a criminal conviction. You still have to disclose it in your personal capacity. It will still restrict things like travel. You'll have to tell insurance companies about it. It will impact on things like ability to gain employment in the future. And there is also a really, really significant impact on you as a person if that happens. I deal with a lot of individuals, and the impact that it has on people's personal lives, on their physical and mental health is really shocking to see, and sadly that happens even where there's no prosecution. Just even the fact of being under suspicion it is very, very difficult to deal with. So that's just sort of a little bit of a summary to give you some context in terms of how the criminal investigation feels. The other thing to say, Toby, just before we talk about the next slide, is to say that these things take a lot of time. So, the investigations take a lot of time, the decisions take a lot of time. And then if you go into the court process is famously very, very slow at the moment. So we're talking about dealing with an issue for years rather than weeks or months.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, perception really stood out there, Rhian. Again, a bit of a false confidence or misunderstanding that the HSE will only speak to senior stakeholders, but it's simply not the case. They'll speak to anybody in the organisation. And this is why it's critical that, across the whole organisation, top down, individuals need to understand who the HSE are, how they operate, and how to come across. And I'm sure that you've seen a lot of the good, the bad, and the ugly, for want of a better phrase, Rhian, over the years. And if we were to look at a scenario, so let's say a serious incident happens, and within hours managers are emailing each other or sending messages on WhatsApp. You've probably seen it. I told them this would happen. He wasn't following the procedure, or that machine's always been faulty or had a problem. So that type of action, what would individuals do? What have they potentially done from a legal perspective if they go down that route of not gathering the facts and sending messages off the cuff?
Yeah, I mean, that happens a lot. And obviously, I think we can all agree that smartphones are a blessing and a curse at the same time in many aspects of life. But yeah, absolutely. We see that happening a lot. Now, the reality is, and it's probably useful if we go on to the next slide actually while we talk about this, Toby, if that's okay. The reality is you're going to need to do a thorough internal investigation, and when something serious happens, really what we're looking for, what I'm looking for, is something beyond your normal incident or investigation report to be produced. And one of the things that I talk to clients about when we're talking about incident preparedness is, let's think about, would you want to do your investigation under legal privilege? And this is basically a way of inserting some control into the process. And what that means is you do your internal investigation at my request or the request of your lawyer. And the reason that we do that is twofold. One is because often we're dealing with corporate organisations, often of some size. And so having an understanding of what the company's account is very, very important. If we boil this down to a more typical criminal investigation scenario, if as an individual you are suspected of an offence, you can go and see a solicitor and you can tell that solicitor, I was or wasn't there, I did or didn't do this, and it's just your account as an individual. Whereas from a corporate entity in a health and safety case, it is much more complicated than that. It is, what were the systems in place? How did this piece of equipment work? Who knew this? Who was competent to do that? There is just so much that goes into it, and so many people that need to feed into it. So this is a way of me understanding what the company's account of the situation is. And because that is being delivered to me in that way, and because I'm going to provide legal advice as a result of it, is covered by what we call legal privilege. And legal privilege is, it's my lawyer's superpower. It's basically a special form of confidentiality, which applies to legal advice. We all have the right to take legal advice in confidence. So what we tell our lawyer is confidential. So what's in the report is confidential. And the advice our lawyer gives us is confidential until we decide otherwise. Okay, so that's legal privilege. And what we will typically want to do, we want to be instructed early, and the reason for that is so that we can set up that process before those WhatsApp messages start to be sent, before people start running off and investigating off their own bat, and everybody's discussed it in the staff room, and the staff room WhatsApp group has gone into overdrive. We want to insert some control into that process. So we can say to the company, it's a very, very quick process. We send an email, we say, please carry out an investigation so that we can provide you with legal advice. We tell you how to do that in the sense of making sure that, you're controlling the documents, who's going to be involved, all that kind of stuff. And basically that means that the report is confidential. Now, this is important because it's one of the first things that the HSE or a regulator will ask to see. Is, can I see your internal investigation report? And you will know, probably most of you, that the HSE have very wide-ranging powers and can even compel you to provide relevant documents. But where a document is covered by legal privilege, you don't have to provide it. That remains confidential. Now, thinking about that in advance is really important. One, so that if you decide that's something you want to do, you've got a lawyer on speed dial who can set that up for you quickly. But two, because for some organisations, they feel like that is a bigger question to answer in terms of does that in any way damage their relationship with the HSE, for example? Are they seen to be hiding things? And the reality is, most big organisations do this. The HSE know this. The regulators know that. It's up to you. Once you've got the confidentiality, you can waive it if you want. You can hand over the report if you want to. But my advice is always, let's get the confidentiality early so that you can then decide what to do with it. And sadly, I have seen many cases where organisations have ummed and ahed about this, sometimes for a week or so after an incident, by which time the opportunity is lost. So I think that's one of the really key things to think about up front for me, and that helps insert that control in the process. The other things that I would say in terms of just managing the investigation process, have a single point of contact with the regulator. A lot of this is simple admin, but the difference that it makes is just immeasurable. So being clear with the inspector investigating, this is the person who you need to deal with. And that means that everything is channeled through that one person, which of course then makes it much easier to track and record what is happening with the investigation. Who do they want to talk to? What do those witnesses do? What kind of documents have been requested? Making sure you're keeping a copy of the documents that are handed over, which sounds mad. And to be fair, it's easier to do this these days with, most of it is done by email, so it's a lot easier to do. But having that copy, because that means that for somebody like me, I'm able to then help you set a strategy. I can see where this is going. I can tell you from my experience, for example, well, this is likely to happen next. We can start to prepare ourselves and to really fill in the blanks where there are uncertainties. We can start to put a bit of a framework around that to help you through it. So that's really, really important, making sure there's strong management of the external investigators as well as your own internal investigators. And just really committing that time to working with the regulator and to cooperating, because again, we've talked a little bit about sentencing. The reason I talk so much about sentencing is because many of you will know the health and safety regulators, I think last year the HSE's conviction rate was 96%. So sentencing is a huge part of what we do. But in sentencing, cooperation with the investigation is a really strong mitigating feature. So it's really, really good to have that in place. So yeah, so those would be sort of some key takeaways for me in terms of managing the investigation, Toby.
Yeah, again, really insightful stuff. I'm sure there's a lot of notes being taken down by the audience today. And I think just for clarity, if you had to give advice on, the people that organizations should know before an incident happens, what were those? We've mentioned solicitors. Who else comes to mind, Rhian, that you would encourage organizations to make sure they have at their disposal?
Yeah, I mean, having a team in place is really, really important. And I think that's, if Toby mentioned making sure that you've got something that works in practice as well as, just a piece of paper in the file, as it were, when it comes to your own incident response approach. And so making sure that your internal colleagues know what they would do and what they need to be doing is key. But so is thinking about who externally will we need to involve in something like this. I call it making friends in peacetime. Think about it now before you really need them, and then the person you really need is on holiday and you don't know who to go to otherwise, or whatever it might be. So thinking about, what is your relationship with your insurance broker? Insurance brokers can be incredibly helpful in a crisis, particularly when it comes to things like funding lawyers. Which of your insurance policies will respond to that, for example? So good relationships with the broker and your insurer are important. From a legal perspective, yes, I would say think about this in advance. And you might well say, oh, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? And yeah, of course I would from a commercial perspective, but I've seen firsthand how helpful it is. If one of my clients who I already know and act for has an incident, being able to go in with the knowledge of the business, going in with some knowledge of the personalities involved, the issues, what it is you actually do as an organization is really, really helpful. So think about, for example, speaking with your broker about whether you can nominate a solicitor on your insurance policy. That has two benefits. One is you get somebody who you can get to know. And so should you need them, it's a friendly face arriving rather than starting a relationship afresh. And then the second thing about that is effectively that lawyer is pre-authorized on your insurance policy, which means they can start to give advice like that straight away, as opposed to you having to put in a call to your broker who has to call the insurer, who then, sometimes it can take more than a week before that whole process comes into place, by which time you've got a week where you've either not taken any legal advice or you've taken the advice and worried about whether you're going to have to pay for it. So that's really, really important. Others who I would involve, certainly health and safety consultants. So if you have external consultancy advice, think about what expertise they will be able to bring to your internal investigation in particular, possibly, but also in terms of thinking about remedial steps going forward and that kind of thing. And then there are a range of others as well. So things like counselling organisations. If you have a very difficult incident, you need to look after people from a well-being perspective as well as from a physical health and safety perspective. And that has become, thankfully, increasingly a feature of investigations that we're dealing with, as people really recognise the trauma, frankly, that people go through when they work in a place and they see something horrendous that happens, or they have to deal with the aftermath. So counselling support is helpful. If you don't have things like HR support within the organisation, if you have a HR consultant, making them aware. Communications, again, if you don't have comms professionals within the organisation, think about some sort of crisis. There are plenty of crisis response communication specialists. And then I would think about other things like occupational health providers might be useful. Sometimes I have some clients who have really good relationships with local MPs and councillors. because sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that helps them with their response if they have a particularly public face, for example.
Sure.
And then things like trade bodies, professional associations and organisations, and also training providers if you need to quickly, for example, upskill people after an incident. Things like training providers are also really helpful.
Got you. That's really clear. Thank you, Rhian.
But just to sort of touch on the other issues on the slide there as well, this is why it's really, really important to prepare, because it's overwhelming when something goes wrong. It's really, really overwhelming. It's really difficult to deal with, and the one thing that you don't have when you are in it is clarity of thought. So it's far better to plot out in advance what this might look like, and so you know that is there. It's like an insurance policy almost for your organisation. Plot it out when you've got that clear mind, you've got that clarity of thought. And interestingly, one of the things that our clients tell us when we will go through this process often with clients, where we'll say to them, right, what are your worst case scenarios? If you're going to have an incident, where is it going to be? What is that going to look like, and what will that mean? So for some organisations, that might mean thinking about, right, well, we send people out to work on different sites all over the country. And so if it happened in a particular place, what might that be? Or it might be a particular part of your own site if you're a one-site business, for example. But one of the things that they often say is, actually, in trying to anticipate where our worst case scenarios might be, it's forced us to look at our risk management in those areas and improve it. So not only does this preparedness have a benefit should the worst thing happen and you have an incident, but actually we find it helps clients in terms of preventing incidents, because they are looking again at actually how are we managing that risk, and what does that need to look like. So I think that's really, really important. And then of course, once you've got a plan, making sure that you stress test it, making sure that you go through your typical plan, do, check, act cycle. You update it when people leave the organisation, just the basics, but make sure that you do test it out, because there is a really close correlation between how well you manage an investigation and the outcome. It doesn't always mean that you would not necessarily be prosecuted, for example, but even if you are prosecuted, it will mean that the regulator will approach it in a different way. But the reality is, from our perspective, what we really want to do is to try to avoid prosecutions at all in the first place, because those conviction statistics are fairly stark. So, being able to manage the investigation robustly and do it well from the outset really pays dividends in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that a lot of the practitioners on this call will do fire evacuation drills, test those religiously.
Yeah.
But we often don't think about the incident response processes and actually strength testing those. So that's a key takeaway from this session. And that brings us on to our second poll of the session. And so what we want you to do in the audience is to answer the following question: which best describes your current approach to serious incident investigation and follow-up? So we've got 5 options. A, we have a clear documented investigation process and it's consistently followed in practice. B, we have a documented process, but it's applied inconsistently depending on the incident or team. C, we investigate incidents, but our approach is mostly informal or varies by manager or site. D, we tend to focus on immediate fixes rather than structured investigations and evidence. Or E, it may be that you've not experienced a significant or serious incident yet, so you're not quite sure. So Hannah, if you could do the honours and open up the poll.
Yeah, poll's running. We've got about 55% participating at the moment, so I'll just give it a little bit longer.
I'm sure we can do a bit better than that. How are we looking now?
Yeah, okay. So the favourite one is option B, followed by option E.
Okay, so a bit of inconsistency, and thankfully many of you who opted for option E haven't experienced a significant incident. So I'm sure that you would have found some of these takeaways quite valuable, and touch wood, you don't experience one, but we need to make sure we are prepared for any eventuality.
Yeah, absolutely. And, failing to prepare, I set out on the slide there some of the impacts, but, it can be, it's very, very easy in the stress of a post-incident situation to compound mistakes and to make things worse. Simple things like managing the people. I mean, I had one client, for example, who came to me when they had been prosecuted. And when I looked at the statements that had been served by the prosecution, I was really struck by how anti the company the employee witnesses had been, which really was at odds with my perception of this organisation and also of the people that I had met. And when I drilled down into it, what had happened was, because the company didn't really know how to deal with the investigation, when the inspector had wanted to take statements, instead of having a process for this, and instead of inviting the inspector into the location, setting aside a meeting room, making them a coffee, organising the interviews all on the same day, this particular organisation had refused to allow the people to be spoken to during their working hours. And so what that had meant was that the inspector was then going around and sitting at the kitchen table in the evening, which nobody wanted at the end of a working day. And it just meant that the opportunity for them to remember all the good things that you've done for them as an organisation was lost, and it came out really very negatively in the way that the statements came across. So having that process and thinking through not only what do we need to do internally, but do we have people who are up to speed on what an investigation looks like? Is our health and safety manager, for example, following what the HSE are doing? Do we need to upskill and provide training? We do lots of investigation management training with our clients for that reason, so that they are ready to go should this happen. So being prepared is really, really important. It can make the legal situation much more palatable. It doesn't always make it go away, I'll be honest, but it does make it much more palatable. It can be really, really difficult. You can see sometimes the sound bites that come out of a court hearing, and when you look back, you can trace them back to where they've come from. And it's often because, in a stressful moment, somebody has lashed out, somebody has said something, someone sent an email they shouldn't have sent, whatever it might have been. So, failing to prepare is really, really, I feel there's just no excuse for it. And, we need to make sure that organisations are ready to go. And, I talk a lot about chaos versus control. The reality is, it's a difficult situation to deal with. And the more that you can insert yourself into the process and control that process, then the better, really, from an organisational perspective.
For sure. And I think to strengthen your position, I would encourage everybody to identify your material risks and just ask yourself honestly whether you could evidence that those risks are actually being controlled, not that you've simply produced a risk assessment, because that is, that's going to be key in the event of an incident, and demonstrating what you've done as an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, from my perspective, this is the takeaway slide here, is to think about where are your biggest risks? If, what are the things that keep you awake at night, frankly? So those areas where you think, yeah, absolutely, we can see that might be an issue. A, because as I said, that can help you with your risk control, but B, it helps you to identify, right, what might it look like, and working through that scenario of, right, there's been an incident, how might that appear? What might we need to do? And making sure that you're then documenting that plan. It doesn't need to be complicated. That's the one thing that I always say, it's like the simpler the better. Even for very large organisations, we'll sometimes work with organisations, it might only be two pages of A4, but it's clear and everybody knows what they need to do. They know the trigger points, for example, when they're going to get in touch with a lawyer because they think they need legal privilege and those kind of things. So having that clarity and making sure that the people who are named in it, A, still work for you, I mean, that's the other thing. Dig out those plans when you get past the office today. Make sure, do those people still work for you? Do they know what they're doing? So that's really, really important. And just go through your plan, do, check, act cycle with it. You know, keep getting it out, dusting it off, even if you've not had to use it. Does it still work? What has changed within the organisation? That kind of thing is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Plan, do, check, act is a great model. We know it's effective, so it's key that we follow that. And that brings us on, everyone, to our final poll of this session. And hopefully you've all taken a lot of insightful pieces from this session. So given what you've heard today, what would be the most helpful next step for your organisation if you want to improve your practices? And Hannah, I suggest you open up the poll in just a moment. But is it A, a confidential discussion about your potential legal exposure following a serious incident? Is it B, an independent review of your current investigation and post-incident processes? Would it be support to stress test your leadership decisions, escalation routes and documentation? Or you may not be sure yet, but you'd like to receive a summary and think about it. So over to you, Hannah, for the poll.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. I'm going to end that there. So we're looking at 56% are saying option D, still not sure.
Absolutely, and that is because the world of health and safety, it can be really complex, can't it? And we need that more than a time on a session to be able to know what the appropriate next step is. So I'm going to lead on to the next slide and hand over to Karina, who is going to cover off some potential next steps to benefit yourselves and your organisation moving forward.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you also, Rhian. And I hope everybody's found the discussion today as valuable as I have. Before we move into the Q&A section, I'd just like to highlight a couple of ways we can help you put today's discussion into practice. So those next steps, as Toby said. So I'm sure you'd rather not wait until you're actually facing regulatory scrutiny to discover whether your systems, your leadership decisions, and your documentation will actually withstand examination. It's always best, wherever possible, to stress test those things beforehand. And that's exactly why at Phoenix we offer a completely complimentary risk-ready review. That's a structured 60-minute diagnostic conversation with one of our health and safety experts, whether that's Toby or a member of his team, and they'll review all of your current arrangements against the regulatory expectations. They'll identify any areas of potential exposure or risk, and they'll provide practical recommendations to help strengthen your readiness. And as I say, that's completely complimentary, no charge at all. So you can access that by scanning the QR code and booking in a session. And then the other QR code, you'll find information about DAC Beachcroft's mock trial training. Again, super useful. This gives you an opportunity to explore and to experience actually how decisions, evidence and organisational actions are actually examined under legal scrutiny. So an extremely useful resource. If either of these would be helpful, we'd really be delighted to continue the conversation after today's webinar. But for now, we'll move into what is often the most valuable part of the session, the Q&A session. Most of you have found this functionality, I think, because we've had a huge number of questions submitted already, which is a great indication. But for those of you who haven't, there is a Q&A function. So if you'd like to submit any questions, please do so now. While you're submitting your questions, you'll see another QR code that just takes you on to a page where you can, again, as a reminder there of both the complimentary risk-ready review and DAC Beachcroft's mock trial program, in case you didn't get a chance to snap that previously. So you can access it via there whilst we're going through the questions section. So as I said, we've already had quite a few questions. We've got just over 10 minutes. So I'll see how many we can get through. And Toby and Rhian, if I just read out the questions, if you just between you decide who's going to take what, that would be great if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I'll get started. The first question we've got is, can a health and safety manager themselves be prosecuted as an individual following an incident?
Rhian, by all means, go ahead.
So the answer to that is yes. But by way of reassurance, it is not something that frequently happens. So just to set in context, the overwhelming number of prosecutions each year are of the employer, so the corporate organisation. We do see a handful of prosecutions of individuals each year, but they are very much the exception rather than the rule. And that is simply because the weight of the burden, the legal burden on employers is so great that it's very, very difficult for an employer to show post-incident they've done all that's reasonably practicable, hence the 96% conviction rate. And it's only really in scenarios where the employer can do that, they can show that they've done everything, that there will be a move to look at individuals who may have a part to play. From a health and safety manager or health and safety professional perspective, your involvement in an investigation is, in my experience, generally twofold. One is you are quite often the single point of contact with the health and safety inspector who's coming to investigate, because you're perhaps familiar with that relationship, so that's helpful. And the second way that you are involved is you are often a witness of fact. So it's a quirk of health and safety cases that you will be a prosecution witness, potentially, so a witness against your own company. But the purpose of that statement is typically to provide to the investigation the health and safety management system, the risk assessment, safe operating procedures, things like that, and to explain how that fits together. So that's usually where the health and safety professional comes into it, and not typically because they're a defendant, thankfully.
And I think I'll just jump in there as well and say, as a fellow health and safety practitioner, I think it's really important, guys, that you remember that you won't know everything. We won't know everything about the world of health and safety. There will be instances where we feel pressure. We're not quite sure of the answer. But the key is to, maintain that integrity and understand that actually, I don't know this, but somebody could help me with this. So I think that's key, because when we see individuals put themselves in a bit of a sticky situation, for want of a better phrase, it's because they've tried doing something or answering something that they didn't quite understand themselves. So just remember, it's a strength. Some of the greatest health and safety practitioners that we meet on a regular basis are those that can turn around and ask for support when they need it.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Okay, then we've got, can WhatsApp or Teams messages be obtained during an investigation?
Yes, is the short answer to that, and we're increasingly seeing that happening now. I mean, when I first started out dealing with these cases, clearly we were dealing with paper a lot. There was a lot of it, whereas now so many businesses use WhatsApp in particular, but also Teams as a way of communicating. So we are very, very frequently asked to advise clients now where WhatsApp group messages are being requested by the regulator. And interestingly, it doesn't mean that WhatsApp is a bad way to communicate. In one case I had in particular in the construction sector, it was commended by the HSE because it was a really useful tool for being able to communicate with people who were out on site and remote from the management at the centre. But I think the important thing to remember, of course, is that we all use WhatsApp perhaps at work, but we all use it in our personal lives as well. And to make sure that the tone of the communication is right, because it's so quick to send a WhatsApp message. But yes, those kind of messages can be requested and often are, I'd say more often than not now.
Mm-hmm.
I only use WhatsApp for gifts, Rhian. All of these things you talk about, for me, I just thought it was for gifts, but just really valid points. But again, it comes down to that internal control that the organisation has. Individuals understanding, the right course of action to take in the event of there being a serious incident. So yeah, great question. Whoever asked that, thank you.
It's okay. And we've had a couple of people asking the question that is around this theme. So it's basically asking, what happens if the HSE asks for a document, but the organisations actually believe that that's legally privileged?
Okay, so if a document is legally privileged, then it doesn't have to be disclosed, and it's simply to say to the HSE, it's legally privileged. So there is, if you are so minded, go and have a look at Section 20 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is where the inspectors get their powers from. And they, within that, there is an exception for legally privileged documentation. Now, the important thing is, if you're going to claim it's privileged, you've got to be sure it is privileged. So you can't simply say, right, I'm going to stamp privilege at the top of every document and therefore that's it. It has to genuinely be legally privileged. That could be a whole another hour's webinar all about legal privilege, but the reality is the HSE will hear it, for example, in connection with internal investigation reports, and they'll understand that some organisations take that route. But if you start saying really odd things like, oh yeah, my RAMs, they're legally privileged, but they're just not. So you've got to be really careful about what you claim. If something genuinely is legally privileged, the HSE, for example, can and do understand that, and it's simply to say to them that that's the position.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Rhian. And the next question is, should employees have legal representation when being interviewed by HSE?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah. So again, this is something, in fact, thank you for the reminder, because it's something I ought to have flagged when we were talking about really preparing and thinking about what you might do. Quite often, I will advise clients that it's useful to have a lawyer sit with employees when they are giving their statements, not because there is any indication that the employee has done anything wrong particularly, but just because this whole process is incredibly daunting, particularly for people who are not used to being in offices. If they've got a very practical job, for example, they're out on site, they're doing this, that, and the other, and then suddenly to come into an office environment and have to sit and talk to the authorities, as it were, about a criminal legal process can be really daunting. So it is helpful from that perspective, so that there is somebody who can explain what is happening, what the purpose of the process is, and really to give some advice around helping the individual to deal with the situation that they're going to face. Clearly, sometimes there will be scenarios where we think that an individual has acted perhaps outside their training or whatever it might be. And again, that's really important that they get legal advice so that they can take the right course of action when they're responding to the HSE. So again, beyond the scope of today, but you can give your statement in different ways. Now, the important thing to flag there is that is not going to be the employer's solicitor that goes to that. So, for example, if I'm instructed for a company, I can't go and sit in those interviews because there is a perception, at least, that I am there for the employer, and that might mean that the employee says or feels they've got to say certain things. So it's an independent solicitor, but that's something that we will frequently deal with our clients. And 9 times out of 10, if an employee feels that they have been supported through the process, they continue to feel good about the company and they feel like they've been supported. And, quite aside from the legal process, that's a really positive thing for a company to be able to do.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, now we've got, what should an organisation do if it discovers during its own investigation that the risk assessments or procedures were inaccurate?
Do I take that on, Rhian?
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah. So during the course of an investigation, if you discover that, and let's be honest, that is often the case in the certainly in the cases that we see, clients will always say, well, what should I do? Should I now correct this? Do I put in place the remedial steps? Because if I do that, am I not just pointing out the things I could have been doing before, and therefore equals I am guilty, or we are guilty of an offence? And the answer is, yeah, you are. And unfortunately, it is a breach. But the reality is the most important thing has to be your ongoing compliance, because if you think you're in trouble now, it would be far worse to leave it, to be on notice of the fact that you've got that risk, and then to have the same thing happen again. Not only from a legal perspective, because clearly the prosecution and the sentence that follows that is far more significant, but also from, again, we've talked a lot about employee relations today, in terms of looking after the workforce. If they feel that something is missing, something is wrong, and you're not paying it any attention, then that stores up a huge amount of different management issues to deal with as well.
Mm. And just to add on to that, Rhian, the road nearly always leads back to the risk assessment, as we know. But very often organisations, they might believe that their risk assessments are suitable and sufficient because they've not been in a position where they've had the HSE scrutinise them, etc. And again, this is why a recommendation for everybody on this call is to go through that testing process, have somebody, a third party, cast their eyes over the risk assessments and provide you with that constructive feedback. And again, it's just a lot more proactive than being in a situation where you reactively need to update your risk assessments, method statements, etc. in a panicked way. So, and again, this is where the risk ready review can support you all. And I think that's about it for time, isn't it, Karina?
Yeah, I was just going to say we've got loads more questions, but if you wouldn't mind going on to the next slide, Tob, because I think the best
Yeah.
thing to do is to wrap up. But for anybody who has a direct question, if you'd like to reach out, sorry, Toby and Rhian, you might get bombarded now, but if you would like to reach out, they have told me that they would be more than happy to have a conversation if there's something burning that you guys want to ask them directly. But for now, we will have to wrap up. And I would like to say thank you very much for joining. I hope you all have a fantastic day. And just one last thing, if you don't already, follow FIIRSM and DAC Beachcroft on LinkedIn. We're forever publishing more content, and also our webinar schedule gets published on there too. So give us a follow on LinkedIn and you'll be kept up to date with everything. But for now, thank you ever so much and have a brilliant day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.